Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today, for our great political film series, it's one guest and two films for the price of one. I'm talking to the American historian Jill Lepore about two films that were released within a few months of each other in 1964. One extremely well-known, one less well-known, but they're about the same thing, nuclear apocalypse. Dr. Strangelove and Failsafe. When we had planned this episode with Jill Lepore, we were originally going to just talk about Dr. Strangelove, and I have to admit, I had never heard of the film Failsafe. I'd never seen it, I'd never heard of it. But Jill suggested that we talk about that one too, and I'm extremely glad she did because I watched it quite recently with no expectations. And I recommend it, though you're going to have to be feeling quite tough to sit down and watch it because it is absolutely terrifying. In some ways, it's the scariest film I've ever seen. And as you'll hear, Jill Lepore feels something similar. The reason we're talking about these two films together is that it is possible that they both drew on the same source material. And even if they didn't, they clearly were made at the same time by people who were thinking very much about the same topic. This is 1964. This is a couple of years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And these two films, in their different ways, contemplate what might happen if America's nuclear defense systems went wrong. They have a different imagination of what might go wrong, but the sequence as it plays out in the two films is remarkably similar. They both consider what an American president would do under those conditions. And without giving anything away, they both end apocalyptically. But at the same time, they couldn't be more different. Dr. Strangelove is a comedy. Dr. Strangelove has Peter Sellers playing three different roles, hilariously. Failsafe is not funny at all. There are one or two mildly humorous moments, but it is played completely straight. Peter Sellers is the president in Dr. Strangelove. Henry Fonda is the president in Failsafe. But the two films together paint a truly terrifying picture of what could go wrong. We start this conversation by talking about Dr. Strangelove. Jill, can you remember when you first saw Dr. Strangelove and what impression it made on you first time round?
It must have been in college. I was in the film club in college. Would never have been something I saw at home. I don't even know if it was ever broadcast on network television in the US. I would be surprised if it had been. And my family didn't go to movies. But I joined the film club and saw everything. And I also took a lot of film studies classes in college. So yeah, I don't remember what impression it made on me. I loved it. And I actually don't really like Kubrick. So I hated 2001 and still do. But I quite love Peter Sellers, Married to an Englishman, and he's a big Goon Show fan. So I have this whole other Peter Sellers world of appreciation. Yeah, I remember just loving Peter Sellers, and it is what the main thing I remember about it.
I think I first saw it in college as well. I don't remember it that well, but I rewatched it the other evening, and I watched it with my 15-year-old son. And he thought it was hilarious, so I was really worried he was going to be bored out of his mind. But he laughed out loud the whole way through. And the people he found hilarious were not the Peter Sellers characters. It was the American general. So General Ripper, General Turgidson, they all have these childish names. But what I don't think he was at all was scared by it. And it's a dark comedy. It's described as the classic black comedy. But at the time, presumably, it was meant to be funny and genuinely pretty chilling. Does it have any of that still for you?
I spent a lot of time thinking about that when I rewatched it. And I, too, have watched it over the years with my kids. Yeah, and they loved it. But the chill, no, it's right after the Cuban Missile Crisis that it comes out. So the reality of that threat, we're not in that moment. We have plenty of other threats. And I almost want to say this seems like a quaint threat, but it wasn't. It just was not. It was a very real threat. I suspect Kubrick really intended it the way Wells intended War of the Worlds, to be terrifying foreboding of fascism and what it would mean to believe what you heard on the radio. But in the spirit of just a very spellbinding form of entertainment maybe that loses a little bit of the threat even at the time. I don't know. It's a good question.
Because in a way, the threat we should still feel it. The central theme of this movie is generals are crazy, politicians are complicit in their craziness, and men are also generally mad. But machinery, technology is dangerous, and we can build into it a kind of mind of its own. So we can build into it in our attempt to secure it. We can actually make it impervious to human input. That's the theme of this film. And we'll talk about another film that has exactly the same theme that came out not long afterwards. That's a very 21st century theme, the ways in which technology might betray us with nuclear weapons. So when I rewatched it the other night, the thing that I found most terrifying about it was all of those themes are familiar, but the central technology on which they all depend is the telephone. Like it's the old-fashioned telephone hotline. They're constantly trying to get each other on the phone. And in one of the key scenes in the film, when Peter Sellers is playing the hopeless sort of British attaché trying to rectify this situation, he has to use a payphone. Colonel Mandrake, he has to use a payphone and he runs out of change. And so on the one hand, that makes it very dated. On the other hand, it makes it very now. Like, the ways in which our technology, our phones let us down.
Well, there's also the transistor radio, because remember, a list has been made of all the radios on the base and they will be seized. And Peter Sellers, as Colonel Mandrake, comes across a tiny little handheld transistor radio. And actually, I think that's a call out to War of the Worlds, where the radio becomes really important, not only as the technology that is necessary to use to defeat the large-scale machine threat, but it also is the large-scale machine threat. It's the control of information that's ultimately the real terror, not the control of the missiles.
And the reason the transistor plays such a role in this film is that they've been told to seize all of them on the base, but one is found. And if it were true that we were on the brink of nuclear war, it wouldn't be playing light music. It's playing light music. But by this point, no one believes anything about anything. And of course, General Ripper says that's exactly what they want us to, that's what they want us to think. That's what they want us to believe. So there's three Peter Sellers characters. I want to just go through them with you, the three that he plays in this film. So for people who haven't seen the film, the setup is basically an American general goes mad, believes that the communists have fluoridized American manhood and sapped it of its vital natural juices, or whatever the phrase is that he uses, precious bodily fluids. And as a result, has unilaterally sent a mission to bomb the commies. The result is a fleet is sent. And the big problem here is that the way in which American defense systems have been set up is once the go ahead is given for a nuclear attack, the human beings involved, the pilots of these planes, are under strict instructions not to believe or listen to anyone who tries to recall them, because that's exactly what the enemy would do. That's exactly how they'll try and mess with your head. And so the only way they can be recalled is if they're given the code, and the only one who knows the code is the man who believes in the fluoridization of the male sexual spirit, or whatever it is. So that's the setup. But in this world, there are three characters played by Peter Sellers. So the first is Mandrake, the Brit. As a Brit watching it, it's excruciating. I mean, how does that character read to you? What's going on with that one in this movie, do you think?
I love that character. I think that he has the sort of inefficacy within the special relationship that Britain has relative to the United States. So he's the reasonable, learned, sort of Oxbridge, very gentlemanly, full of restraint. He's immensely polite. And he's desperate, and he's the good soldier. He's the man who was tortured during the Second World War. Comes up that he had been tortured by the Japanese, and he's like, that wasn't a bloody great time. Or, he has this like very offhand way of remarking on his own military valor, which he wears very lightly, as opposed to the disgusting, insane bravado of the Americans. It is Britain being held hostage by America's madness.
And in this film, literally.
Literally, he's being held hostage by General River.
So what it reminded me of, that Malcolm Gladwell article, I think it's from about 20 years ago, he wrote about why certain planes crash and other planes don't. Certain airlines have a history of crashing, and Qantas have never had a crash. And his explanation is, in certain cultures, the number two can't tell the person in charge that they're doing something wrong. So in the article, he has the transcript of a Korean Airlines crash where the plane is flying into the mountain. But because the co-pilot is in a deferential relationship to the pilot, the co-pilot can't say, we're crashing into a mountain, turn the plane. The co-pilot has to talk politely and say things like, don't you think the weather is a little bit murky today, as they fly into the mountain? And that's exactly what this reminded me of in the special relationship. And he does play it hilariously. Politeness is all because he's aware that he is the subservient character. And the plane isn't just flying into the mountain. The world is going to end. And he's trying to find a way to communicate it, which is consistent with his sense that he mustn't overstep the mark. It is hilarious. It is genuinely, that bit is genuinely terrifying. So then you've got the president. The president is called Merkin Muffley. The names are really childish in this movie. Now, my understanding is that Peter Sellers based that characterization on Adlai Stevenson. And it's kind of interesting why that, this is the era of the Kennedy presidency. We're after the Cuban Missile Crisis. The president, in most people's minds, the film came out after the assassination, but it was made before the assassination, is Kennedy. But in this movie, it's a kind of Stevenson-style president. And I assume what's being satirized here is the idea that they're all complicit in it. Even the supposedly reasonable ones are part of the madness.
I mean, Stevenson, the bald man, is the man behind calling intellectuals eggheads. That's a slur that's designed to attack him and to attack the role of intellectuals in democratic kind of late New Deal politics. So he for sure does embody Stevenson as the kind of effete intellectual. I mean, part of the Republican attack on Stevenson was the suggestion that he was homosexual. So there's this sort of weird sexual politics going on as well in Sellers' depiction of the American president. But on the other hand, I think he also reads to Americans, and this is a reason that Americans failed to elect him president twice. He reads as somewhat European.
A European president, because the generals are very American.
Yes, but he doesn't come. I mean, I don't know. How did you find it? Did you think that the American president seems as distinctively American?
I mean, I thought it was odd because this is an age where there's been a bald president, Ike, but he's a soldier president. He is a general. And then there has been with a good head of hair, young, virile president, Kennedy. And Stevenson is the failed candidate who is neither one thing nor the other. But in this movie, he is the president. And he tries to reason with these people. And that's part of the comedy. He also, in his way, tries to be polite. He knows it's his job amidst all the madness to keep some modicum of control. And that's what lets the madness take hold. He can't do anything about the craziness of the generals.
But I think that's part of a larger critique of the absence of leadership in the face of automation, that it's not actually possible to be a decent leader when you have outsourced major decisions to computers. That's part of the critique. You couldn't have Kennedy because Americans believed Kennedy was powerful and an effective leader, whereas they did not believe that of Stevenson.
But in a way, what it's saying is it doesn't matter that much. And part of the point of the movie is once the accident or the act of madness has happened and the chain of events starts to unfold, it doesn't really make much difference who's in the war room. And the other thing about the war room in this film is there are loads of people in there, right? I mean, it's absolutely packed full of men in uniform, none of whom says anything, none of whom does anything, all of whom just look on in horror. They are just bystanders. And the only one who speaks is General Turgidson, who is himself a kind of lunatic, but a very potent man, a man whose sexual prowess has already been laid bare to us.
Honestly, my favorite scene in the movie, I don't know the actress who plays his mistress/secretary. The very first scene when he gets the phone call and he's in the bathroom and she's wearing a bikini for no particular reason. And there's a call comes in from a colonel and she keeps code switching between saying, Freddie, well, what is going on, Freddie? I'm afraid he's in the powder room right now. And her body changes and she seduces the telephone apparatus when she uses her seductress voice. And then she puts on his secretary voice. General Turgidson is not available, sir. And she keeps going back and forth and back and forth. And then the women just basically disappear. It is not a film about women. That is not the way these genre films are working in the 1960s. but it's kind of a knockout performance about the performance of women for men that just gets kind of lost in where the film goes from there. But I think it's a really genius little bit.
And she does also, though we don't hear her voice, she, in the midst of the crisis in the war room, her boyfriend, the general, has to take a call from her and he's really embarrassed. But at the same time, even though it seems pretty likely the world is going to end, he still has to say to her, don't worry, honey, I'll be home soon. And then I'll show you, Bucky will show you who's the real man around here.
Yes. And the question of women comes back in the very last scene. So we can just come back to that.
Yeah, with the third of the characters that Peter Sellers plays. So he plays this stiff upper lip British attaché who in the end comes close to saving the day. He keeps his sort of cool and he gets the coins and he gets the telephone to work and he does work out what the code is. It's too late, but he works out what the code is. There's the president, Merkin Muffley. And then there is, and it's a role that one forgets, it's a tiny role in the film, Dr. Strangelove. So when I was watching with my son, we were 8 minutes from the end and we were both thinking, we haven't seen much of Dr. Strangelove. His great scene is still to come. But the final part he plays is Dr. Strangelove. So who is he in your mind? Who does he represent?
Dr. Strangelove is some sort of physicist who was an ex-Nazi physicist. He is in a wheelchair. He has some kind of a prosthetic arm that keeps inadvertently Heil Hitlering. And he's constantly fighting with his own body to stop himself from, and he keeps calling the president Fuhrer. It is a Command Sellers performance of complete lunacy wrapped up in this very tightly wound little character.
And he stands for, in this movie, not the crazy military, not the compliant politicians, but science, I guess, and the sort of science that was thought to lie behind mad, mutually assured destruction. He's the rationalist who is willing to calculate these unconscionable odds of survival. It's a comic performance, but underneath it, there is presumably a pretty serious critique of mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, and this will come into when we get to the twin of this film, which is that the social sciences in the 1950s had been really overrun, become the behavioral sciences, and overrun by quantification and prediction. And in the US, for instance, the Ford Foundation would only fund social scientists if they were doing predictive work. So the predictive work of, calculating the missile trajectory and the possible loss of life and using computers to do so, that came out of the Second World War, it became dominant in the social sciences. And so you have people of the Dr. Strangelovian variety who are quantitative natural scientists, but are who also merging into quantitative behavioral science. So they can do things like calculate the number of lives lost with a certain scale of an attack, but they also then profess to calculate the possibility for human society to reconstitute itself in the aftermath of global thermonuclear war. So it's the madness of both mutual assured destruction and also of the calculation of the possibility of survival. And he kind of embodies both of those schemes.
Yeah, at the end, he talks about what's going to be necessary for survival. And he says, they're going to need to be 10 women for every man. And, there's going to need to be a lot of potency down in the mine shaft.
Yeah, no, you get to the end and it's like, oh, this is what Strangelove wanted all along, to get rid of most of the people and be confined for 100 years underground with a ratio of 20 women to 1 man. That's the entire fantasy of the Cold War from Strangelove's point of view. And it does actually encapsulate a whole set of forces in American culture and in Cold War culture more broadly. So he doesn't have a lot of lines, but he carries the moral weight of the film.
And he's what people remember about the film. Afterwards, people said he was Henry Kissinger, but as Henry Kissinger pointed out, when the film was made, no one had heard of Henry Kissinger. But somehow that association got made after the event.
Yeah, and sometimes people think of General Ripper as Robert Welch, the head of the John Birch Society. There's a kind of critique of Bircherism there. The Birch Society was obsessed with fluoridation as a communist conspiracy. So I think that you can play that game and find likenesses in various people. But yeah, Kissinger doesn't work.
One thing that is clearly referenced in the movie is they talk about the Bland Corporation as being behind some of this research. So this is definitely Now, there's the Ford Foundation, but there's also the Rand Corporation. And one of the running jokes in the film is these people are always obsessed with the possibility of the creation of a gap. So there's the doomsday gap. When they hear that the Russians might have a doomsday machine, which is the end of all life on Earth, they're still obsessed with the thought there might be a doomsday gap. And then at the end, Turgison starts to worry there might be a mineshaft gap. Because maybe their mine shaft might be deeper and their men more potent than our men in our mine shaft after the world has ended. And that's all a satire of this, isn't it?
And if I remember correctly, Kennedy defeated Nixon partly on the argument that the Republicans allowed a missile gap to develop. And it was complete fiction. He just made that up. He coined missile gap. There was no missile gap. But it is thought to have been really influential in his election of the presidency in 1960.
So in this movie, there are all of these gaps. I kind of feel it's a bit of a cop-out to make him a Nazi. So that's the thing I remembered from seeing it first time round, which is he represents social science gone crazy, the physical sciences gone crazy, the Rand Corporation, the role of this kind of quantitative predictive work in the fate of the planet. But then he calls the president my Führer. He wants to, give him the Heil Hitler salute. And it's kind of like a Get Out. People remember that he's a Nazi, and a lot of these people weren't, right? I don't know. It felt to me a little cheap.
It lets people off the hook.
Yeah, Dr. Strangelove is a Nazi. Well, I thought the point of Dr. Strangelove is that Dr. Strangelove is the American establishment, and they weren't all Nazis.
I can see that, but he's funnier as a Nazi.
And he manages to make calling the president mein Führer funny. Right? I mean, Peter Sellers is genuinely hilarious in this film, in each of these three roles. So let's talk about the other movie, because what's so interesting about this film is that it came out almost at the same time, but you can tell the story of how they ended up coming out at different times. But a deadly serious film on the same topic. So the other movie is called Failsafe. Just tell us a bit about the history of the relationship between these two films, because it ended up in a lawsuit with Kubrick effectively trying to stop the other film from coming out first.
Yeah, and sadly, many more people have seen Strangelove than Failsafe, and I think Failsafe, had it come out alone or first, would have been remembered as a really important film. And I think it's remembered as a very great film, but not an important one, because it was really in the shadow of Dr. Strangelove, and that was a consequence of a legal dispute. So there was a book published maybe in 1960 called Red Alert that tells the story of essentially the same basic plot of both movies, which is that due to a mechanical error, an error of communication with a computer system, a group of American planes is sent to bomb the Soviet Union and they can't be recalled. And Kubrick bought the rights to Red Alert and then just basically threw the book away. The writer of Red Alert is given a writing credit for Strangelove, but the book doesn't have Dr. Strangelove or most of what happened. It's not a satire. The book is just a pretty kind of weak piece of science fiction, near future science fiction. And so Kubrick just basically wrote a completely different story, but he did buy the rights. And then he found out that a political scientist at the University of California, Berkeley, Eugene Burdick, who was maybe the most well-known American political science of the day, was writing a film with a colleague, a guy named Harvey Wheeler, that told essentially the same story. And Burdick was really interested in these stories of machines run amok because he had witnessed what the funding from places like the Ford Foundation and the Rand Corporation had done to political scientists, which was increasingly machine-based. And so he had been asked to join this company called the Simulmatics Corporation, which was using a UNIVAC and then an IBM 704 to predict election outcomes and sell campaign advice to the DNC and to the Kennedy campaign. And he started writing a book about this machinery and how wrong it was and how bad it would be for American politics, kind of predicting exactly the world that we now live in. And he was trying to sell the film rights to that book, but he also was really interested in this story about machines run amok with regard to the deployment of nuclear weapons. So Kubrick got really mad and he did this kind of clever thing. He sent Eugene Burdick in registered mail a copy of Red Alert so that he could prove in court that Burdick could not say, I've never read it, never seen that book, because Burdick had insisted that they were just writing a screenplay from a story that Harvey Wheeler had written. And anyway, Kubrick sued to stop production of Failsafe. And the way they settled out of court was Columbia Pictures, which was producing Dr. Strangelove, agreed to buy and produce Failsafe, the movie. and to hold it for 6 months and not release it for 6 months after the release of Strangelove, which was in some ways a good outcome for Verdict, because otherwise the project would have been completely killed. But it was a terrible outcome for the prospects for the movie. Failsafe was directed by Sidney Lumet. It stars Henry Fonda. Walter Matthau has a leading role. There are all kinds of bit characters, like Dom DeLuise is in this movie. It is in some ways visually similar to Strangelove. They're both shot in black and white. There are some quite entirely parallel scenes. There are some very haunting scenes in both of being inside the cockpit of the bombers, and you hear this thrum over the actors, and they have their oxygen masks on, and we're looking at their panels a lot. There are a lot of scenes that are very similar, like in a war room, looking at a giant screen display of the missiles. It looks like a Space Invaders screen for those of you who remember your 1990s video games. So there's quite a lot plot-wise that is just essentially the same. It's the same plot. Henry Fonda plays the president. Henry Fonda had just come off basically playing Adlai Stevenson in The Best Man. The Best Man is a film about the 1960 presidential nominating convention. And Henry Fonda plays the Stevenson-like, very moderate Democrat who's seeking the nomination, and the nefarious stuff that goes on. It's written by Gore Vidal. It's a great political film. But so Fonda was really interested. It's like he plays the president twice in a row, and he plays it quite similar. In Failsafe, it's as if the guy he plays in The Best Man actually wins. He doesn't win in The Best Man. He's defeated through these scurrilous political behavior of his opponents. But it's got a differently dark ending, and I would say it is maybe the scariest ending of any political film I've ever seen.
I think it's one of the scariest films I've ever seen, full stop. But like you say, when you watch it, if you watch the two side by side, and I'd recommend that people do, and it is weird to think that the funny, dark, satirical one came out first to kill the other one, because if you watch them side by side, the other one almost pushes the dark, satirical one out of your mind. You think that was a bit lightweight because this is the serious one. But it does, like you say, it does have those overlapping scenes. So one of the things that I was really struck by is there is that moment in both films where, even in Strangelove, where the pilot of the plane that is going to end up dropping the bomb is himself a kind of lunatic. I think he's called King Kong. He puts on his cowboy hat and he ends up sitting on the bomb as it drops. But there is a moment where he also has to open their instructions and see whether this code is for real. There's this endless protocol where you have to validate whether your instruction to finally drop the big one is for real or not. And in both films, there's a moment where, for the people in the plane, the penny drops. They go through, they're expecting something to stop it, and it doesn't. And they get the final confirmation. And in both movies, once you've got the final confirmation, unless you get another code, nothing is meant to turn you back. And in both films, that is chilling. It's equally chilling, I think, even though then in Strangelove, it goes off in this sort of manic direction, whereas in Failsafe, it goes off in a completely tragic direction that we'll come to. But those bits are very similar. And that is the common theme of the two films, which is essentially once this thing is underway and you've created a system where the failsafe is, because human beings are susceptible to interference, you will tell the human beings not to believe any of the interference that comes in telling them to stop. Once it's underway, it is incredibly hard to stop it.
Yeah, and I think it's likely that the films shared a similar set of military advisors who were providing information about the reality that this is kind of how it worked. Like, I don't think there's a lot of make-believe in the telling of that story, because there are many alternative paths along the way. Oh, this is just a test. Oh, there's been this one little mechanical failure. We'll just fix this. Oh, we'll radio them and call them back. Oh no, the radio's broken. Or in Failsafe, the Russians have actually jammed the radio, so the Russians are participating in the nature of the problem. Oh, okay, well, we'll repair the radio, and then we'll have the president get on the line. Oh no, well, they'll actually, if they're not going to believe the president, let's get the pilot's wife on the line. It's the iterative quality of, we're on this train and it is moving very fast, but there are a lot of stations to stop at before the train's going to go off the cliff. In both films, structurally, you keep thinking, well, they're going to stop this now. Or, you're led, like all the characters, to believe this can't actually, this little thing, what is it, but for a nail? Like, this little thing can't lead to the destruction of the planet. It can't possibly like, how could that happen? But there's no putting the pin back in the grenade once you pull it.
And in Failsafe, the Americans, to start with, the generals, the soldiers, the people at the Air Force Base, they all behave a bit like the Peter Sellers British character. They're very calm. They say, we've been through this drill many times before. We have these false alarms. There's a congressman who's visiting and he looks absolutely terrified. He thinks this is scary. And they're like, there's nothing to worry about here. There's always an explanation. And then almost with each character, there's this terrifying moment. And with the president, it comes last of all, where they realize they've passed the point of no return. And I think the most haunting scene is the one you mentioned, where the wife of the pilot calls him up. So when they manage to resume radio contact with the plane has flown past the point where in the protocol, the pilots are told, if you get past this point and the president comes on the line, don't do what he says, because now you're in Russian airspace and it's probably a fake president that they've concocted to persuade you to turn back. And meanwhile, the Russians have blown up the United States. So they don't listen to the president. But then his wife comes on, the pilot's wife, and she is hysterical. And it's the last chance. And it doesn't work. And it's really harrowing.
Yeah, and that's why it's so much scarier than Strangelove. You said, I mean, did you watch Failsafe with your 15-year-old or no?
Yeah, he fell asleep.
He fell asleep. But if you manage to stay awake, it is a great movie, but it's terrifying because these are perfectly reasonable people. I mean, Walter Matthau, we haven't talked about yet. He's not a sympathetic character, but he's not General Ripper, So the American generals are, they're trying to protect the country. They have a military mission. They have a lot of protocols to follow. They have a lot of safety measures. They know how to proceed. They're very respectful of one another. They're very concerned about the consequences of their actions. They're noble soldiers. They're good soldiers. And still, at the end of the movie, it's it's really, the ending is just, I cry at the ending of that movie in a way that is a kind of deep, like, probably we're really doomed way.
Both films have exchanges between the President of the United States and the Russian Premier. In Strangelove, the Premier is called Kiss Off because all the names have to be joke names. But it is the case that in both movies, in those exchanges, the same dilemma is faced, which is the world's going to end. It's a classic game theory dilemma. The world's going to end. Neither side wants it to end. But the only way it can be prevented from ending is if some trust is established. In Strangelove, we're told that Kiss Off is almost certainly visiting his mistress. He's drunk. He's like a caricature of what you might imagine a version of that character might be. In Failsafe, it's a deadly serious exchange. And one of the weird things about watching Failsafe is that Henry Fonda is in the basement of the White House. And it's very odd because you associate these showdowns with kind of Kennedy and his team of advisors around him. And that's what you get in Strangelove. So the president's on the phone to the Russian premier, but he's got like 40 people around him and he's got Turgidson mouthing obscenities at him. But in Failsafe, the president's on his own, connected only by a phone system, which thank God it works. When he clicks the button and says, get me the ambassador, he gets the ambassador. And then the only person in the room with him is Larry Hagman, JR from Dallas, playing a young translator. And he's told, don't just translate his words, but try and hear in his voice what he's feeling, because the only way we're going to save the planet is if we establish trust. And of course, the tragedy in Failsafe, let's give away the ending, is it turns out the only way to establish trust, once it is clear that a bomb is going to drop on Moscow, is for the American president himself to authorize that an American plane drop a nuclear weapon on New York.
So the bombers in Failsafe, they managed to shoot down some. The U.S. fighters managed to shoot down some at the sacrifice of their own lives. The planes that are sent to attack the bombers, it's in the Arctic. They're just going to crash and they're all going to die. They have this big decision to make. They know they're not going to be able to rescue any of those guys. They shoot down some. The Russians shoot down some, but the Americans are sending all these decoys and it distracts the Soviet forces. They're unable to shoot them all down. One plane gets through. And Henry Fonda is on the line with the Soviet premier, with Larry Hogan next to him. The still from the film, the most memorable still, is just this close-up of Henry Fonda's face holding the phone receiver and this giant, like, lumpy phone in front of him. He's on the line with the premier when the bomber drops the nuclear bomb. It's like a 20 megaton bomb or something on Moscow that will destroy the city and kill millions of people. And the phone line goes dead. And they have arranged that in order for the Soviets not to attack the United States with all of their missiles in a response strike that would take out dozens of American cities, that Henry Fonda will direct American bombers to drop an equal size nuclear bomb on New York City, where, as it happens, his wife is that day, his own wife. And this is the only way to prove that the first attack was itself accidental. And the movie ends with, you see the pilots flying over Manhattan, you see the familiar cityscape from the sky, and then there's this very staccato kind of slideshow of scenes of ordinary life in the city, girls doing double dutch jump rope on a sidewalk and kids running through a fire hydrant and people walking into their office buildings. And you hear this terrible noise and all goes black. And it's just eviscerating. It has a kind of cinematic weight that is actually earned by the storytelling over the previous 2 hours, because we've been building to it, but it seems escapable at every moment. And you've watched yourself convince yourself at every stage that this is avertible. And you've watched the characters convince themselves that there has to be another way. And then it is, in fact, actually the leadership of the American president, right? No one is demonized here, not the Soviets, not the Americans, none of their underlings. There actually is no mistake. Everyone's just doing their job. And even the American president is doing his job when he destroys New York and kills everyone in the city. And it's that kind of lumpy thing you have to swallow that is the inevitable logic of the arms buildup of the 1950s and 1960s.
And in a way, it's saying when the systems and the technology and the machinery trap us in their logic, the only way to assert that human beings are involved is to do something which is, it's almost beyond human comprehension. So my son woke up right at the end. It's like, the president's just bombed New York. That's not going to play well with the electorate. That's not going to work. And yet, like you say, by the time it happens, you are convinced it is the only thing to be done. The only way a human being can assert human values over technical values is for a human being to do the inhuman thing. And that's why it feels like we're all doomed. The only way that the humans can assert themselves is to do something that no human being should ever do, maybe could ever do.
Yeah. And I think maybe I misspoke when I said no one is demonized, because I think Walter Matthau is a bad guy in this movie. He is the Strangelove of this movie. And so he is not off the hook. He's not a Nazi. He's a very debonair, like he's a public intellectual.
He's a political scientist.
He's a political scientist, but he's the kind of political scientist that has, a Pentagon pass, and he's down there all the time. And so this was, I think, fairly closely based on Ithiel de Solapool, who was the political scientist at MIT who tried to get Eugene Burdick to join the Simulmatics Corporation that was doing this kind of Rand-like stuff. I wrote a book about this company a few years ago called If Then. So I spent a lot of time with Burdick, who wrote Failsafe, and with Poole, who Burdick then went on to write another book about. So Poole was very proud of his security clearance. It was a kind of hot ticket in academia to be someone who had Pentagon access, that would be flown down all the time to swan around with the generals and be sought after for your advice and make your predictions. And Failsafe opens in this truly wretched, like, I would rather die than go to this cocktail party that Walter Matthau is at. I think he's supposed to be in DC, and he's just like bloviating at the very Tony guests with his, whatever theories about the latest missile technology. And
also about how many deaths the United States should be willing to contemplate. He gives his kind of Strangelove style speech at the beginning, not at the end.
Exactly. And that's why it's fun to watch them back to back and watch Strangelove first, because then you sort of see, okay, what if you invent Strangelove as, I don't think of Walter Matthau as handsome, but he's very debonair. He's wholly charismatic, and he's in a tuxedo, and he's, very American and revered and respected and not mocked in any way. But he's essentially saying the same thing. Oh, wouldn't it be fine because we'll all go live on the survivors will live underground and we'll have a lot of women and we'll come back out and it'll be fine.
And he also, at one point in the film, deploying the logic, which he is there to kind of give the generals his sort of social scientist logic. He's the one who advocates, once it's clear that the plane is going to get through, this is America's opportunity to launch a first strike attack and actually win the war over communism, because it turns out he is also a rabid anti-communist, and he is a better dead than red kind of guy. And he says, by the logic of our defense system, we're never allowed to be the first strike. But this is a golden opportunity because a mistake has been made. And now that a mistake has been made, we're further along down the path. So now we can legitimately launch a first strike, because if we don't, the Soviets will attack us. So this is our chance to win the war. And he starts saying to the generals, all of whom look at him as though he's mad, this is a golden opportunity. Thank God, the system, the computer system malfunctioned, because this is the only way we're allowed actually to nuke the bastards.
I was just reading, have you seen this thing called the Digitalist Papers? So like the Stanford AI Center or something came out with the new Federalist Papers for the 21st century, and they're mainly written by tech CEOs. And I tell you, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, these guys are not. It's basically of Strangelove trying to write the Federalist Papers for the age of AI. So one of these guys says, I don't forget what he is the head of, or he's some AI forward economist. Oh, it's great that we're going to have so many bots because the human population is dwindling too fast around the planet. And just in the nick of time, we'll have all these robots instead. Like, did Kubrick write that line for you or what? Like, we still live with those guys, right? They're at Stanford, a lot of them. But, you and I know those political scientists who are like, oh, AI will solve democracy.
Yeah, this thing that looks like it's a disaster, actually, it's a stroke of good fortune, because this is the next leap forward.
It's good for me. All things we already destroyed with our last set of tools, well, we'll fix them with a new set of tools. Yeah, we still live in that world of the 1960s. The machines are different, but the people are the same.
And that's Walter Matthau in this film, who, it should also be said, there's a creepy scene early on where the good-looking woman at the cocktail party throws herself at him. And so he does what a good, well-trained political scientist does. He slaps her and says, you're too tawdry for me. I'm not a slut, he says. And then he goes off to advocate the destruction of the world.
Tens of millions of human beings for the sake of, his political power.
He's a seriously creepy guy. So I was also thinking the other thing that connects these two films is that, so the phrase I have for it is it's a catch-22. And I think catch-22 came out just before these two movies. I think the novel came out in 1961. And that is the term I think we would now use to describe a situation in which you are so worried that the other side will interfere with your systems that you try to make your systems fail-safe. And having made your systems fail-safe in that way, once they go wrong, not because of the other side, but because of a failure on your side, you have built them such that if anyone tries to intervene to rectify the situation, it becomes evidence in the mind of the system that the other side are messing with the system. So that's why it's so haunting when first the president and then the wife of the pilot come on the line. And it's the one moment when Henry Fonda loses his cool and he becomes himself almost hysterical. So he can connect with the Soviet premier. There is a human connection there on the hotline, but he can't override the sort of catch-22 glitch in the system, which says, if the president comes on the line sounding hysterical, that's evidence that the Soviets have messed with the system. And that's the thing that both films have in common. Although I think in Strangelove, there's a kind of cop-out, because in Failsafe, there is no way out. But in Strangelove, they do get the codes and they do recall all of the planes. And the one that doesn't get recalled is only not recalled because its code system has been blown out when the plane was attacked by Soviet anti-air missiles. So it's just another accident. Actually, in Strangelove, Peter Sellers' Mandrake, the British stiff upper lip guy, almost saves the world. He comes incredibly close to saving the world because he works out the code. They send it to all the planes, but one of the planes, by an accident, has had its recall system damaged. But in Failsafe, there is no other accident after the initial accident. and nothing anyone does can prove to the system that the system has malfunctioned. And that's why it feels very 21st century to me.
Yeah, no, that's why it's so scary. The inevitability of our powerlessness in the face of machines.
We're not past the risk of nuclear Armageddon, and even, especially, one might say, in the age of automated weapons technology, right? My 15-year-old son saw the film and he thought it was hilarious and not scary. But it should be scary because these weapon systems are more automated than ever, and presumably they all have fail-safes in them. And presumably when these systems fail, one risk is that the fail-safes make it hard for human beings to intervene to correct the system.
So I once heard an interview with a U.S. general who had written a dystopian War of the Worlds novel about U.S. going to war with China in the near future. And he was interviewed, and one of the things he said was the science fiction of the 1960s, Failsafe and Strangelove, chief among the most influential works, had huge consequences for America's defensive posture and contributed to the nuclear freeze movement, to the arms limitation treaties, to the test ban, to all the steps that were undertaken to mitigate those kinds of risks that were exposed by science fiction, novels and short stories, but especially in films. And that it was his view that that work was not being done in the present day, and that he wanted to model his work on that kind of politically conscious science fiction. That he did not succeed is perhaps slightly revealed in that I neither remember his name nor the name of the book that he was writing. But I remember thinking that was an evocative story because it's often a frustration. A lot of people who are climate change activists or environmental lawyers talk a lot about the storytelling problem of climate change, that insisting as if it's just really a narrative structural problem. Like, where is the silent spring of climate change? The 1962 Rachel Carson book that really changed the conversation about environment, about pollution, and led in the US to all of our landmark environmental legislation, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the EPA, all the things that we have really come from that book and its influence. And there have been films like in the 1980s, there was that film The Day After in the US. It was like a made for TV movie about the day after a nuclear attack that I think are thought to have been influential in the second round of SALT talks and things like that. But the things that your 15-year-old are most worried about, maybe climate change, maybe the AI takeover there a lot. There's the whole Terminator world of AI takeover movies, but there's really something missing in the storytelling about climate change in a Hollywood sense. So I don't know. I guess it's a question I have about that moment where these films, I think, did do a lot of work to changing people's ideas about this particular set of risks and actually influencing policymakers. I mean, I don't have evidence, so maybe I'm wrong about that. But I wonder about the absence of those kinds of films in thinking about the climate.
Dr. Strangelove, the film begins with a piece of text which has the standard thing where it says, any of the characters in this film are entirely fictional and resemblance to real people, blah, blah, blah. But before that, it says something along the lines of, we contacted the Department of Defense and they have assured us that the problems highlighted in this film don't actually apply and there are safeguards against them. And when I saw it, I thought, I don't know if this is satirical or not. I don't know if they put that at the beginning as itself a joke or whether actually that's true. And they did contact the Department of Defense and they did say, we are aware of the risks of this kind of malfunction and you need to know that we take it seriously. It could be both. The thing about Dr. Strangelove is that it simultaneously is satire and also deadly, deadly serious.
The system is just SAGE, right? The SAGE system that gets operational in 1963. Like, I think the system is meant to be the real system. Whether there were better protocols than the ones that we see in those two films is a question, but the system was highly publicized in 1963.
And it doesn't say at the beginning, we've contacted the Department of Defense and they've assured us that their generals are not as mad as the generals in this movie. The last thing to say about Dr. Strangelove is that there is going to be a revival on stage in Britain, it's interesting. So Armando Iannucci has co-written a revival, a stage revival, with Steve Coogan playing the Peter Sellers roles. On the one hand, I don't imagine it will be all that. On the other hand, it is interesting that it is being revived now.
It is interesting that it is being revived now. I think we need newer stories. I don't know that revisiting Strangelove, much as I would like to see Coogan in these roles, I want to see it, but
It's not going to save the world.
Yeah, it'll just be, how do we read this for our times? But I'd love to be proven wrong, and that it would be great.
We mentioned in that conversation that there is a stage version of Doctor Strangelove in London, and actually, since we recorded it, it has opened, so you can now see it. It's had, I'd say, mixed reviews, but it sounds like a pretty interesting production. The next film that I'm talking about in this series, before we come back to the American presidential election and I check in with Gary about the actual result, if we have it. But before that, one more great political film from the 1960s, The Battle of Algiers, a truly remarkable film about a real political event filmed in a way that has influenced cinema ever since. And coming soon, we're going to have a bonus episode for PPF Plus subscribers in which I'm going to be talking to Helen Thompson about Apocalypse Now. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.